Hi, and welcome to the lecture for Module 15, where we'll be talking about Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. In Module 14, we talked about realism, and I mentioned that Edward Monet is this important proponent of the Impressionist style as well. So we'll talk about how Impressionism develops out of realism. Within that, we see a lot of modern subjects and scenery. So again, I'm going to talk about various aspects of modern light. With the Impressionists, you have this significant emphasis on light and color, and especially different optical effects, what painting can achieve. Now with Post-Impressionism, this is this very loose title to refer to a whole bunch of different things that emerge out of Impressionism, after Impressionism, including two particular movements called Pointillism and Symbolism. And with Post-Impressionism, we see a strong interest in formal qualities and the emotions of the artist. Like last time, we'll be talking pretty much exclusively about art centered around the Paris art world, although we'll talk about some things that are produced in other places as well. But again, France is the center of the art world in this period. So I want to show you this image by Claude Monet just to give you some background on Impressionism. It's a style that evolves in Paris in the 1860s from realism and continues into the early 20th century. It made its way to Great Britain, the United States, and abroad in Europe. It's largely a movement in two-dimensional media, especially paintings, prints, and pastels. It's an important avant-garde style, like realism challenged artistic convention and tradition. It was also initially met with strong resistance from academic audiences. It officially became a style in 1874, when the first exhibition of artists whose works are largely characterized as Impressionist were held, and they displayed together. They did not display in the salon. It was held at a private art gallery, and Impressionists were really the first to truly break away from the salon tradition of the Academy. The name Impressionism came from a critic, and it was meant as a negative description of the sketchy and fleeting quality of the impressionistic images. It becomes the name that was embraced by a very diverse group of artists who, above all, conveyed an interest in representing momentary glimpses of contemporary life and color. They hold 8 exhibitions between 1874 and 1886, and now those participating in the exhibitions varied each time. Some artists displayed in every single one, others displayed only a couple of times. So there's this, it's sort of this loose grouping of artists who self-identified as Impressionists. As I said, it developed from realism. They're a generation just slightly younger than artists such as Courbet and Monet. There's this emphasis on contemporary subject matter, modern subjects and scenery, like this train station that I'm showing you here. But Monet is exploring the atmospheric qualities of light inside this space, the effects of the smoke. It's an art that derives its aesthetic from empirical observation and analysis. They're recording what is and what is present rather than trying to create a contrived illusion. But there are some important distinctions that should be made between realism and Impressionism. The contemporary subjects that Impressionists focused on were typically urban scenes and subjects. Again, this frequently bourgeois leisure pursuits and pleasures were something they were interested in, much like Manet. Frequent subjects include genre scenes, scenes of entertainment, landscapes, cityscapes, and images of modern industry. Aesthetic interests were of greater importance than political messages or controversial subjects. Impressionists, even more so than realists, show an interest in exploring optical realism and the natural properties of light and color. Impressionist artists often studied objects in various times of day and in different lighting conditions to experiment with optical and color effects. They often also worked in a mode called en plein air, which is painting directly outside to study the effects of light. But they also did the same with artificial lighting, so they're not always painting outside. They also explored new influences for new compositions and pictorial effects, especially Japanese woodblock prints of the 18th and 19th century. They saw in these new ways of depicting space, color, line, and patterns. They also looked to photography for this idea of fragmentary images and a sort of casual informality of images that suggests moments in real time rather than timeless illusions. So I want to start with this work by Claude Monet, who is probably the most famous Impressionist painter. This dates from 1872 and is titled Impression Sunrise. More than any other 19th century artist, Monet embodied the technical principles of Impressionism. Above all, he's a painter of landscapes, although he also painted images of city monuments and industrialization. He's important as an artist for his studies of light and color in his paintings. He did much of his painting outdoors in this plein air effect, which is in sharp contrast to academic painters. This is a characteristic of Impressionism that really sets it apart from other artists before them who still largely worked in their studios. Even realists did. They might go out into nature and sketch, but then they would come back and do all of the painting, all of the working in their studios. Now this has to do also with the invention of something in particular, that is the collapsible tin paint tube. Because before that was invented, you couldn't just go to the store and buy paint. It had to be mixed up in your studio. Artists had been doing this for centuries, and with the invention of these collapsible tin tubes, paint could be pre-mixed and then filled into these tubes, which could be easily transported, and it wouldn't ruin all that hard work of mixing the pigment and oil in your studio. So that term Impressionism that the style is named for actually comes from this painting. This was exhibited in 1874 with other works by Impressionist painters. The term Impressionism implies spontaneity and speed, which I think is very evident in this picture. The brushstrokes are loose, light, and sketchy. Only basic information is given to give you a sense of space or forms given here. So I think you can tell you're looking at a scene taking place on the water based on these strokes of red dashed in, of pink reflecting the sky and the sun above the water. These rough patches of paint represent boats and people standing in boats. You get a sense of an industrial landscape, some other ships, and smokestacks in the background. But really you have to do a lot, your eye has to do a lot of the work for you, piecing these together. The painting is devoted to giving us Monet's impression of a sunrise at a particular moment and in a particular location. You have this vivid orange of the sun, blues, grays, and pale lilacs for the sky and water. The colors are not blended or are so very minimally. He preferred applying color in individual brushstrokes, in this case largely painted horizontally. You can see the hand of the artist present in this picture. The method not only gives us a sense of motion and time, using very economic and quick means, but also he paints using patterns of color to reflect the way light strikes the human eye. Your eye doesn't perfectly blend these things together. Your brain does a lot of that work for you. So it's a very contemporary modern scene because of the industrial scene in the background. The painting vividly conveys not only a fleeting glimpse of the sun rising here at this place, but also the sense of transience on account of urbanization and industrialization. Life is moving at a very quick pace here, and Impressionism is a way to capture just this one fleeting moment that could never maybe be captured in the same way at any other time. I want to move on to this painting now. What I'm showing you is Monet's Rouen Cathedral, the west facade in sunlight, dated to 1894. And this should look like something we've seen before. Now, we didn't talk about Rouen Cathedral, but we did talk about a number of Gothic facades, and Rouen is another one of these huge Gothic churches in northern France. Monet often works in series in order to get a sense of light and shadow and color on a particular object or in a particular setting throughout the day. In his Rouen series, he painted en plein air at various times of day to record the optical effects of natural light under differing atmospheric conditions. For this example, he painted somewhere around 40 views in all. And here is a slide just showing you 4 others of these images of Rouen Cathedral. So you can see he changes the framing of the painting somewhat, even though you always have this central portal as your major subject. But I think from this series, even just these 4 images, you can get a sense of the different times of day he's painting. I think you get a sense that some of these are in the middle of the day, some of these are very early morning, some are at sunset perfectly, some are at sunrise. So he's working in all of these different modes in order to show how important light is to this aspect of painting. So let's go back to this image now. As I said, this was the Gothic cathedral in northwestern France. Your book has selected this image where we're seeing the facade bathed in sunlight. Everything is depicted through brilliant colors. So the actual monument seems to be dissolving into daubs and swaths of whites, yellows, oranges, and blues. Color is used for shadow as well as light areas. So it's sort of like what we talked about with Vermeer, the acknowledging that shadows aren't just black. The finish of the canvas is incredibly rough and sketchy. A convincing illusion of three-dimensional space is not Monet's goal. Impressionists, you can always tell you're looking at a painting because you have all these unblended brush strokes. It's a two-dimensional surface holding this paint. So he's telling us this is a painting while at the same time experimenting with representing through paint how the eye actually sees. So he's not trying to make it look like a cathedral, but he's examining how light hits this stone and how his eye actually sees that. And now your eye does the work of finishing this and understanding that it's a cathedral, but again, he's interested in the optical effects that light provides. Now I'd like to move on to this painter, Pierre-Auguste Renoir. We're looking at his painting called the Moulin de la Galette from 1876. Another common subject for Impressionist painters were the leisurely pleasures of urban Paris and other cities. And this emphasis on leisure of the bourgeois class was a positive outcome of urbanization and the regulation of labor. So realist artists reveled in the negative outcomes of this urbanization, while the Impressionists, because they were centered in Paris, focused on the positive aspects of this new way of life. Renoir specializes in scenes like this. The painting is of a popular courtyard at a dance hall in the district called Montmartre, which is part of Paris where nightclubs and entertainment were. And it was an area of much inspiration for modern artists. If you've been to Paris, hopefully you've been to this section of town. There's a lot of cool cafes. Even still today, you see a lot of artists up there. It's a nice neighborhood way above the rest of the city of Paris. Here we have an emphasis on the liveliness of the scene and of the individuals. They're happy and enjoying themselves. They're completely casual and unposed. So again, we have this impression that the scene goes on well outside of the picture plane, capturing a slice of Parisian life. It's an instant in time that will soon pass, which is perhaps more moralizing than what Renoir would have wanted, but he's interested in this idea of leisure and the passing of time in the modern world. We see this very loose brushwork, lots of patterns of light and shadow, and the use of some really brilliant color. It all enhances this effect. The loose brushwork enhances the effect of this as a fleeting moment in time, as does the fragmentary and a bit tilted perspective. And here with the tilted perspective, it's not completely skewed, but you can see how the background rises fairly sharply and at this weird angle. And this is something that Renoir and other Impressionist painters are getting from Japanese woodblock prints. There is this sense of joie de vivre, this joy of life. He wants to imply no political messages or moralizing meanings, but instead playing with the effects of light to show this transient scene and this emphasis on urban leisure. I love the light in this painting. Now, Impressionism isn't my favorite style, but the effects of light are just incredible. So if you look at the dancing couple here in the background, you get a real sense of movement in the patchy qualities of her skirt, the very barely picked out faces, the dappled light around them. I love this man's jacket here. You get a sense that he's under a tree and shadows are falling on him from that, but so is light through the branches. This woman seems like she's just leaned in and they're having a good conversation. They're enjoying themselves. It's all about pleasure in the city. Another well-known Impressionist painter is Edgar Degas, and here I'm showing you his Dancer with a Bouquet Bowing from about 1877. Degas exhibited with the Impressionists and was friends with several of them and artists of later generations. However, he's not as interested in landscapes or cityscapes as some of the other painters are. His artistic passion was to depict human forms moving through space. He's most famous for his images of dancers and entertainers in practice or on stage. When you think of Degas, you probably think of his scenes of all of the ballet dancers in the studio, on stage. He reveled in the controlled patterns of motion that dancers produced when performing, so this is why he's so interested in that. The perspective in the scene is rather fragmentary and tilted, which helps to incorporate the viewer further into the space. So we have a central figure who the painting is named for, Dancer with a Bouquet Bowing, but there's a lot of scenery, and this stage goes back very quickly in space where you can see the rest of the dancers gathered. This void in the center of the painting between this primary figure and those in the background enhances the effect of pulling you into the space. The perspective used here also gives it a sense of spontaneity. The figures are casually arranged as if caught in unexpected and a rather ordinary moment at the end of a dance recital or performance. Some are even fairly outside of the picture plane, like you see on the left here. So he was interested as well in experimenting with effects of photography in his images. Degas was an amateur photographer and also used cameras to help him work out his compositions. And the easiest way to see that is by the fact that we have half cut off figures, because photography, of course you can compose it in particular ways, but often it captures these really fleeting moments, people walking on and off the scene, and Degas is incorporating those ideas into this painting. Also, the influence of photography can be seen in blurring and focusing changes. And again, he's exploring the pictorial effects of Japanese woodblock prints. So here I'm showing you a book by Utagawa Hiroshige called Night View, Sarawaka Street at Night from 1856. And you can see this very characteristic spatial organization. So you have a sort of linear perspective going on, but the space recedes very, very quickly. The vanishing point is way back here over to the side, the strong diagonal, and the way that the horizon has been placed, this low horizon line, means that all of the lines of the architecture of the street are rushing towards it, and nearly every single figure in this painting is moving that way as well. So this tilted perspective is something that the Impressionists and the Post-Impressionists were very interested in. In Degas' work, hopefully you can see the impact that Japanese spatial organization had on his own works. You have interesting avenues into the image. You have not a real strong sense of perspective since we're lacking architecture, but you do have these wide expanses that recede very quickly and these sharp diagonals to the background. You have this flattened sense of space and linear qualities and reductions of forms to shapes and areas of color, which is how Impressionists actually described their working practice as well. So in the background, you see these flattened orange triangles as part of the stage set show the influence of Japanese prints as well. So these flat patches of color and the very tilted perspective. And this is something we see with Post-Impressionist painters as well. So now I'd like to move on to Post-Impressionism. So Impressionism became very influential for artistic experimentation, and it facilitated development of other movements, and these are loosely characterized as Post-Impressionist. It's a term that is very broad and categorizes artists and artworks of the late 19th century and even into the early 20th century, which basically just means after Impressionism. There's a lot of diversity within Post-Impressionism, and it's not a specific movement, but we can categorize them in this way because they were all influenced by Impressionist color and light and the revolutionary treatment of the painted surface. But they wanted to incorporate further either the subjective response of the artist or to reintroduce more formal qualities of art, that is line, form, color, etc. So there's two major approaches. You have the expressive and subjective exploration of color and line with figures like Vincent Van Gogh and Paul Gauguin, and then you have the analytical and theoretical exploration of color and line. And we'll start with that second idea with this work by Georges Seurat, which is called Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte, dating from 1884 to 86. Seurat was another French painter who worked primarily in Paris. He was initially affiliated with Impressionism like Gauguin or Cézanne, and he exhibited with them in the 1880s. He shared a similar interest in color and light and representing the leisurely activities of modern Paris, just like the Impressionists. But his style reflects a more scientific and analytical exploration of color and light rather than capturing the momentary. He's also different from Van Gogh or Gauguin in that he did not use color and form for emotional or expressive means. He knew very well about contemporary color and optical theories, and he applied these to the contemporary scenes preferred by the Impressionists. So his purpose was to reintroduce the formal and structural approaches of the old masters, but within a new and modern style. Seurat saw himself as a beacon of modern artistic theory, and he was very influential for other contemporary artists, the Neo-Impressionists as well as 20th century artists. Seurat is best known for his development of a system of arranging color onto canvas called pointillism or divisionism. And here I'm showing you a detail of one of his works. We can see that this pointillism is the system of painting in which colors are separated into their component parts. That is, green is both blue and yellow, which are then applied as separate tiny dots or daubs of pigment onto the surface of the painting. These colors then register from a distance rather than seeing them really close up. And in that way, it's similar to Impressionism. We've seen this approach before. An important precursor to some of these optical devices was Vermeer in his Geographer. Remember his idea that shadow is not just made up of black, it's affected by the colors around it. The result of this is that we have a very abstracted and rigid representation of a slice of modern life. So the scene here on La Grande Jatte is a local French island on the Seine River where Parisians from all classes would often go for pleasure. It's a very controlled composition. There's no sense here of spontaneity that we saw with the Impressionists. There's certainly an interest in light and color, but it's composed within a tight, static composition. The forms are almost abstracted into geometric shapes, and there's very little movement. In effect, what he was trying to do here was to record an aspect of contemporary urban life in a style appropriate to it. That is, it's a very modern, theoretical, scientific approach, just like modern life was. But he also wanted it to be worthy to be compared with the great models of the classical past. It's an approach that reflects the interest in merging modern with traditional methods and contemporary artistic theory. So he's got a lot of goals in this, looking to the past while also trying to be utterly contemporary. He's more impressionistic than post-impressionistic, especially in his approach to color. I want to keep moving because we have several things to look at today. Now I want to look at Vincent Van Gogh, his bedroom at Arles from 1889. Van Gogh is a painter from Holland, and he's the first major painter from the Netherlands since the Baroque period. He becomes an artist rather late in his short life. Only in the last 10 years of his life was he a painter. Before then, he tried a spiritual life as a missionary, and he considered becoming a priest. He was a very tormented man and eventually died after shooting himself. However, it is a common misconception that his works are the product of insanity. He was actually quite lucid and innovative when he painted. There are many autobiographical aspects to his work nonetheless. He also created many self-portraits. Even though he was from Holland, he eventually relocates to Paris to begin his career as an artist. He was initially influenced by realism and impressionism, but soon moved towards a style that entailed a very expressionistic and subjective use of color and line. The last few years of his life, he lived in Arles, which is a village in Provence in southern France, and his most famous paintings come from this period of his life. He wanted to establish an artist community there, and Gauguin even went and spent some time with him in Arles. This painting is characteristic for its expressive use of color, line, and brushstroke for emotional effect. Well, we're not seeing exactly an emotional response depicted here. We see his bedroom here, but it's not a very welcoming room. There's actually kind of a sense of anxiety and isolation in this. There's no people present except in the portraits on the wall, one of which is a self-portrait of the artist. The artist can also be seen as present in his clothing hanging on the wall and through the other objects that might be used in his day-to-day life, such as the pitcher and the basin on the table, the glass, the towel hanging here. I think that the very sharply receding perspective, and again derived from Japanese woodblock prints, also gives it this sort of tension and anxiety. It doesn't seem like a very welcoming space to enter into, especially because it's so deserted. We know that Van Gogh was aware of contemporary color theory, but in his paintings, Van Gogh often uses complementary colors for psychological effect. And remember, your supplementary reading for today includes a letter by Van Gogh describing his choice of color for this painting to his brother Theo. The texture, I hope you can tell from this that there's a lot of actual texture to this, because he often directly even applied paint from the tube onto the canvas. So not even using brushes or a palette knife, he often just gooped it on there, so you can see just how textural this is. I think especially in the floorboards, in the seat part of the chair, in the frame of the bed. The perspective is fragmentary and tilted, similar to Degas, again because of this influence of Japanese prints. So Van Gogh's paintings often have this sense of isolation, but with him you see this really strong interest in color. And this is maybe not the best example of this, but often his colors are chosen very carefully to express certain emotions in the paintings. He would often choose color not based on what the scene actually looked like, but on what conveyed the proper emotion of the scene. So let me talk now about Paul Gauguin. Here I'm showing you a self-portrait of his works. He exhibited initially with the Impressionists from 1879 to 1876, but then he explored new avenues. He becomes interested in a style called Symbolism around 1889, which is the date of this self-portrait. He deserts his wife and 5 children when he starts painting full-time in 1882. Prior to this, he was a stockbroker. And as I mentioned already, he spent a year in Arles with Van Gogh. In the 1890s, Gauguin actually moves to Tahiti. Tahiti was a French colony in the South Pacific in the area of French Polynesia. And the work I want to talk about in some detail today is from his Tahitian period. Gauguin was continuously searching for an ideal primitive culture, although once he got to Tahiti, he was disappointed because it had been well colonized by this point. He thought Tahiti would be this new Eden, and he found when he got there that he was quite wrong. So this painting is called Nevermore, and it's from 1897, and Nevermore is named after the Edgar Allan Poe poem featuring the raven, and we see the raven depicted here in the background. You can also see the title inscribed in the upper left and Gauguin's signature just below. So this painting captures Gauguin's interests in simplicity and natural qualities of Tahiti. This was an interest that was becoming rather widespread in avant-garde circles as well as with modern audiences. At this time, we see an interest in non-Western cultures and the foundation of ethnographic museums. And these introduced non-Western art to artists, which is another reason that Gauguin went to Tahiti. It was this whole new world of representation. Gauguin, importantly, was one of the first artists to truly embrace an interest that becomes coined as primitivism. So looking for this more primitive world, turning away from modern life and using aspects of these primitive cultures. Now I'm using that word primitive in quotation marks because it's not really an appropriate way to talk about some of these cultures today. With his Tahitian pictures especially, Gauguin combines an interest in dreams and myths of symbolists, and the symbolists were really interested in choosing color based on emotion rather than what actually existed. But he combines that interest in dreams with native subjects of Tahiti. You have very simple forms and an almost childlike rendition of space and volume, or a lack thereof. So you've got a very typical reclining nude. We looked at a number of those in our class, but she's quite different than what we've seen before. She's not looking at us. She's not really idealized, and she's in this very tense and anxious moment, I think. We see in this painting his interest in challenging traditional systems of perspective and illusionism by building up the images through patterns of line and unmodulated color. So you have these significant patches of flat color, and then the decoration that he includes on the walls in the background or in the trees that you can see through the doors here. It's very flat. It's creating a pattern rather than creating an illusionistic space. The palette is rather soft and reflects Gauguin's perception of local color and scenery in Tahiti. So the meaning of this painting is quite complex, and it's still a bit vague for scholars. You have a sort of sense of danger with the figures who seem to be talking back there and the raven behind her, and she seems aware of all of it going on. So again, this is named for the Edgar Allan Poe poem, and Gauguin knew Poe's poetry through French translation. And that poem, Nevermore, has some sinister undertones of fear and anxiety itself. So Gauguin has his own type of post-impressionism with these non-Western themes and Western themes merged together. So American poetry, known through French translation, in this island setting, using some symbolist color ideas, flat patterning that was visible in Japanese prints and influential to the Impressionists. So he's a really good example of combining history with the contemporary in his own particular setting. The next artist I'd like to talk about is Paul Cézanne, and I'm showing you his work called Mont Saint-Victoire, which dates to about 1900. Cézanne was another French artist who lived in the south of France, but he frequently traveled to Paris. He's similar in certain respects to Seurat, in that he was influenced by Impressionism. He worked initially with the Impressionists and exhibited with them. He learned from another Impressionist named Pissarro, who taught him to work en plein air, and he focused on typical Impressionist subjects, especially landscape. So he was interested in this Impressionist subject matter, but especially in exploring properties of color and light. He also focused on introducing a greater sense of order and form that distinguishes him from the Impressionists. So he was interested in Impressionist subject matter and exploring properties of color and light, but he focused on introducing a greater sense of order and form which distinguishes him from the Impressionists. He developed an intellectual approach that consciously built upon and yet at the same time rejected tradition. In this respect, he is one of the most significant figures. I think he's a really important transitionary figure between Impressionism and what happens next in modernism. The painting here, for example, is a landscape and therefore a depiction of nature. It was actually a scene he was very familiar with, and he represented it over and over and over again. So if you look for images of Mont Saint-Victoire, you'll get several different examples coming up. It's a local scene from his homeland, this well-known mountain in the southern part of France. It's a very different approach to nature than what was represented by Impressionist artists. It's not fleeting or transient. He represents the mountain and the land around and below it as a patchwork of shifting planes of color and geometric shapes. This is how he believed that nature was ordered. We know this from a comment he made where he said that the natural world can be reduced to a cone, a sphere, and a cylinder. His brushwork is broken and visible, similar to the Impressionists, but it's been flattened into patches of unblended color, creating an ambiguous sense of space and broken system of perspective. He's creating a sort of tension between the two-dimensional quality of a painting and the three-dimensional, or the attempt at representing three-dimensional space. He uses cool and warm colors to create recession into space, so exploiting those aspects of atmospheric perspective where the warmer colors appear closer to us and the cooler ones are where the light recedes. The result is an abstracted quality that gives us a nature through the subjective yet highly intellectual interpretation of the artist. He would be very important for the development of Cubism in the early part of the 20th century with the artist Picasso. So it's a revolutionary moment in this breakdown of Western notions of space and illusionism. So it's sort of an extension of what Monet was doing in flattening out the surface of the painting. But he takes that to the landscape, which is something that is very three-dimensional, a mountain, trees, hills leading up to it. And he does it with this technique that's often referred to as color block painting, because you have almost cubes of color. And other versions of Montserrat Victoire show this even more, but this is the one that your book has chosen to illustrate. I want to end today with another example of symbolism, which I mentioned briefly with Gauguin, but an even better example of that is the artist Edvard Munch. So let me tell you about symbolism. It's a literary and artistic movement that develops in the late 19th century that emphasizes internal psychological phenomena rather than objective descriptions of nature. Symbolist is rather anti-realism and anti-impressionist. Even though it's post-impressionist, it's still rejecting what came before it. It rejects the social consciousness of realism and the impressionist interest in nature and the outdoors. Instead, you see an emphasis on inner fantasy and psychological truth. The symbolists believed that by focusing on the internal world of dreams, it was possible to rise above the here and now and arrive at the universal. It's closely related to music as well. They desired a unity of sensorial experiences. It's almost exclusively a European movement, but was especially strong in Paris and Belgium. Symbolist artworks often emphasize personal, emotional, and psychological interpretations through very expressive use of color and line, which this is an excellent example of that. And this expressive use of color and line was crucial for the development of Expressionism in the early 20th century. And we will talk about Expressionism in our next couple of modules. So I'm showing you here this painting by Edvard Munch, which is typically called The Scream, although you'll also see it sometimes titled The Cry, and it dates to 1893. And the medium he uses is oil and pastel on cardboard, so not your traditional oil on canvas. Munch was a Norwegian painter and printmaker who was influenced by symbolists after traveling and working in Paris around the turn of the century, so near 1900 and even a little bit before. He, like so many other artists we've talked about, was a tormented individual, and his art is a very personal testimonial to his struggles with love and death. He often depicted images that spoke to his personal and emotional responses to love, death, and sexuality. He developed a very expressive style through color, line, and figural distortion to describe the conditions of the psyche in modern life. So not everybody loved the modernization of the world. To some, it was rather torturous. So his style is very close to the post-impressionist styles of Gauguin and Van Gogh, but the subject is more closely related to the symbolist idea in that his pictures, and this one in particular, depict states of mind, emotions, or ideas rather than observable physical reality. The painting here is set on a Norwegian fjord, so you can see this bridge very quickly receding into space. This line is very sharp and dramatic. You can see a couple of figures in the background. You can start to get a sense of water below if you look closely. A couple of boats are here. And this was a site in Norway that Munch frequently traveled to during his life. The figure in the foreground is probably supposed to represent him as he described in his description of this work. And then again, as I said, two figures in the background who are walking away from him. Are they his companions? Are they just other visitors to the site? The landscape setting is just discernible, I think, with the water. And then you've got this sky almost on fire. It's not naturalistic in any way. And the subject is not who these individuals are and what they are doing, but instead the subject is really the psychological state expressed here. I have a quotation from Munch about the experience depicted in this painting. He said, "I felt as though a scream went through nature. I thought I heard a scream. I painted this picture, painted the clouds like real blood. The colors were screaming." So the figure not only appears to be screaming, but starts to merge with the landscape in the color, in that wiggling line. So the landscape can be read as echoing the emotions of the figure within it, as nature screaming and causing the figure to scream. The line is very heavy and expressive, and it unifies the entire scene into one seething and writhing toil of emotions. The colors chosen, you mostly have these black and then pinks and yellows in the bottom, but then in the sky you have this bright and fiery orange and red, causing this eerie glow to the scene, which seems to be reflected in the wood of the bridge, in the water itself. So it's a very interesting painting, all about psychological turmoil. So we covered a lot of information today. Remember, Impressionism stems out of realism, but they focus more on modern subjects and scenery. And the Impressionists are really interested in light and color and optical effects. How does your eye actually see a scene? And they tried to capture that aspect of modern life. With Post-Impressionism, you have a varied group of artists who are deriving certain ideas from the Impressionists, but taking them in different directions. So, for example, Pointillism with Seurat, and then Symbolism with Gauguin and Munch especially. You also see this interest in formal qualities, so think especially of Seurat with color or Cézanne with form, and then the emotions of the artist become that second set of major criteria of the Post-Impressionists, especially with somebody like Van Gogh and Munch. So now to finish Module 15, you'll need to take the self-assessment. There's an audio post for today, as well as a discussion board prompt, and the vocabulary wiki is the responsibility of Group 2. So thank you for listening, and I will see you for Module 16.